Hello, everybody. I'm Alix Steel, an anchor here at Bloomberg Television. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a very exciting panel lined up for you, so I just want to get right to it. Joining us is Joy Fitzgerald, Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer over at Eli Lilly. Also, Jim Hemerling, he's Managing Director and Senior Partner at Boston Consulting Group. And we also have Molly Hellerman, Global Head of Innovation Program at Atlassian. Atlassian, as Carol was just saying, is the sponsor of today's event. Guys, it's great to see you all. Now, on our prep call that we did, what came out is that all of you basically during the pandemic did a lot of surveys and talking to your employees. And I wonder if we could kind of go around, starting with Joy, and what'd you learn? What was your biggest takeaway and what the role is that you have in the company right now?
Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm very delighted to be here with such great company. At Eli Lilly and Company, I have responsibility for our diversity and inclusion strategies. And, this year has been one for the records, I think, in unprecedented times for all of us. We get the pulse of our employees in a myriad of ways, including surveys, our employee journey research data, but also one critical way is working with our employee resource groups. We have 11 ERGs within our company, and each one of them are focused on a specific demographic, and they are very critical for us understanding really those key insights and stories that exist behind the data. And one of the things that we've learned this year more than any year is the power of human connections. Our employees have stated to us through various means that they want to connect more with their colleagues, with their leaders, so that they don't feel alone and in many regards isolated. We've also had to recognize the emotional toll that this pandemic has placed on everyone, and for many to varying degrees. So we are still working to respond, but also ensure that we are restoring the confidence and helping to keep our employees focused on what's most important.
And Molly, let's go to you next. You guys also did a lot of surveys, so I'm wondering kind of what were some of your biggest takeaways in canvassing your employees?
Yeah, thank you. I also am really happy to be here. Thank you for inviting us. So we actually host a pulse survey every 2 weeks. It goes out to the entire company, and we've had really high response rates. And what we've found is that there's kind of three key hallmarks. First is that we do it really frequently. And so we're able to maintain questions, benchmark them and move along, but also add questions that are really relevant to the moment. The second thing is that we have a high level of transparency around it. So we rapidly share back to the company what we've heard. And then connected to that, we have a lot of really quick action that comes from it so that we can see what happens. We have a build, learn, measure model so that we're able to quickly look at it, see what's working, see what's not working, and then adapt as we go. And so if you take, for example, the questions around, we had one that was, how do you feel? Do you feel highly productive? Do you feel motivated? Do you feel supported? Things like that. And so what we were able to do at the very beginning of this pandemic, some of the responses we got around what was hindering motivation, was hindering productivity, was around household setup. And so we were able to give stipends. We were able to work with ergonomic folks to figure out how we could figure that setup. Then it moved into things like family balance. How do I find this balance? My kids are home, things like that. And we were able to provide different sort of programs and policies around that to give people increased leave, but also provide camps and tutoring and different options around that. And then most recently, what we've seen is that it has dealt a lot with connections. And how do we build connections given that those hallway conversations, those water cooler moments are no longer exist? And so we've started to put in a whole host of programs around that. And so I think when we look at the sum of this, the ability to continually iterate and innovate around it is what has allowed us to be successful in these programs. And that is central to my role at Atlassian, to your original question, that I lead our innovation programs here.
All right, Jim, you're up.
Super. Yeah, in a similar vein, I would say we also regularly survey our employee base. And what we've found is that the issues really fall into four categories. There's a category around their physical well-being, emotional well-being, the social connectivity and social connection, but interesting also productivity, which is that we're finding that it can be more challenging, particularly as you work in teams, to have the same level of team effectiveness that you have when you're physically co-located with people interacting with each other in real time. I would say one other thing that we found, which is, I guess, obviously once stated, is that the challenges are very different for different segments. And so, for instance, not surprisingly, working moms face a disproportionate challenge in this environment where you're having to care for your own children. And unfortunately, it still disproportionately falls to working mothers. Many of them, of course, are homeschooling and trying to deal with those challenges. Many also actually have the responsibilities for extended family members, where they're trying to care for aging parents and so on, all from a remote, challenged environment. And so one of the things that we found has been very helpful is, don't assume your reality is someone else's reality, but in a true sense of the word empathy, you want to understand what are the challenges faced by different groups, and then tailor your policies and changes to those specific needs.
Such a great point. And Joy, this leads me to something that Eli Lilly did that I read about a couple months ago, and it was fascinating. And it was basically trying to tackle diversity within the workforce using a template that you guys use when you're looking at patients and drugs. And I wondered if you could explain to me kind of what that process is and then what you learned, because as Jim so rightly pointed out, it's different for every subsector. And in the middle of all of this, we also had a George Floyd murder. We had an election. There was a lot of other stuff happening.
Yeah, you're so correct. We turn to one of our business processes in which we use to better understand what patients experience during a life cycle of an illness. And we recognize the need to use that to better understand women, African Americans, the Latino population, Asian, and most recently, we've been doing that to better understand our LGBTQ population. And one of the common things that we use is both a qualitative and a quantitative, extensive research process. And it's really about not only understanding the employees inside of our company, but also what's hardwired into their DNA, even prior to joining our organization. For example, what are little girls taught that are different than little boys? And how does that manifest itself and show up in a workplace? And how does that information better help us create a more welcoming and inclusive environment? And one of the consistent things that we learned across many of those demographics, but to varying degrees, was this concept of psychological safety and emotional well-being, and how important that is for people to feel safe, to show up as their true, authentic selves. Based on these findings, we created an initiative called Make It Safe to Thrive, which is really intended to help create the skills and the behaviors inside of our organization that teaches our leaders and our employees some of those watch outs, or some of those rules to those gray spaces of just core everyday behaviors that might stifle or compromise one's psychological safety. And as part of that, all of our leaders are required to attend that training. It's an instructor-led training. And we require all of our employees to take a computer-based training. And recently this year, after COVID-19 hit, we heard from some of our employee resource groups that they wanted to talk about psychological safety through the lens of a pandemic. And we offered 12 sessions over 12 weeks. They were 1 hour long, and we invited all of our employees to attend. And we dealt with topics like living alone, surviving COVID-19, how to be a school teacher and an amazing executive. Just a myriad of things that now look different for a lot of our employees, and helping them to just have the safe space to talk about these things, but also equip our leaders with better skills.
So I have to be super honest. I may have received some surveys of some stuff, and I just kind of delete. I don't have time. I don't have time. How would you guys reach me if I'm not participating? This is also, I was going to ask the question, but it also came from the audience as well. If people aren't volunteering the information or they don't participate, like, how do you make sure that you're also getting to them as well? Molly, you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I think there's two ways that I'd like to talk about it. The first is sort of the progression that we have from micro interactions, things that happen on a day-to-day basis with your colleagues, with your managers, that then kind of lead into team interactions, company-wide, and then policy. And so I think when we look at this piece, it really does focus on that micro interaction and trying to create, as we spoke about earlier, Jim mentioned, as well as Joy, that the empathy piece of it. So how do we change what we do in one-on-one conversations? How do we give managers and just team members in general different prompts that they can use to understand what's happening? So as opposed to jumping right into work, you might say, how are you? Where are you at? On a scale of 1 to 10, how are you today? 10 being amazing, 1 being really horrible, and then being okay with leaving it there, right? And teaching people to give folks the space to process as they need to. I think oftentimes as managers and as friends, we want to jump in, we want to solve, we want to make it better. And sometimes people just need that space. So we're giving managers that type of training, we're giving Atlassians that type of training. We're trying to support through external resources. So we have mental health and other types of trainings and coaching and counselings available for free for Atlassians to participate. There's digital content. And then what I find really interesting is the tips from each other, right? So we host a number of conversations across the organization, whether they're in mentoring circles or in your functional area, where people share. They just plain out share, like, hey, this is, and I heard a great one the other day. It was a manager who said, every time I read a blog or I listen to a video, I write the person who wrote the blog or who put out the video, and I say, hey, that was really encouraging, or I like this, or thank you for doing that, even if they didn't like it, thanking them. And I think that kind of interaction, that micro connection that we miss now, because every interaction that we have right now is intentional. Anytime I talk to someone, it is intentional. There isn't the happenstance that you get in a hallway. And so that's one way that we tackle it. The other way that I think Atlassian really tried to look was outward. We held a longitudinal study and look at workers around the world. And basically we found exactly what Joy was suggesting, and that there are so many roles that people have to play. And depending on the complexity of your household role, your individual role within your team, and then your network, you're going to have a different makeup. And what we found through that study is unless we can really connect with people, unless we can acknowledge their setting and then try and help support it, that people will feel disconnected, people will feel less motivated, and more invisible. And ultimately, that's not what we're going after. So we use that as a hook to try and get Atlassians, to get managers to really start to care about those micro interactions, which they have. And we've had some great success with that.
Yeah, Jim, you were nodding, Jim?
I was just going to do a +1 to that, which is a few years ago, we were facing, let's just call it, regular challenges of helping our teams, our teams feel that they're being supported and productive, and because our business runs on teams that typically are co-located with clients. And so we developed something we call PTO, which stands for predictability, teaming, and open communication. And what we do is every 2 weeks with each of our teams around the world, so literally thousands of teams, we have a facilitator who meets with those teams for half an hour. We do a little pulse survey in advance to gather some information on how they're doing. But then we have an open communication with this facilitator about how are things going with your team. So that has proved to be very powerful in this environment, as you might imagine. And what we're doing now is we're making sure that when we're talking about predictability, teaming, but also open communication, we're really tilting that toward these current challenges of the challenges, particularly around physical, emotional, and social well-being. So that's one tip I would say is make sure that you're actually really investing in connecting with teams or individuals in groups.
Joy, did you want to add on that?
I was just sitting here thinking about that, and I think one of the hardest things for leaders to adjust to, as Molly talked about, is this concept of listening only without trying to solve or fix something. And really not only listening, but hearing even the things that aren't said. People come to work and they want to deliver their best. They want to deliver excellence. And we've had to figure out what perfect enough means. Because let's be clear, none of us are going to be excellent at all of these new roles that we're trying to manage and still be whole and well, psychological safety, And also, emotional well being is core for us to deliver on our best at work. And I think having leaders kind of hold their hands and just be a good ear and to make a human connection first, now more than just the business, because when we connect on the personal level, it's so much easier for people to feel valued and then want to contribute more to our core business needs.
So I have to wonder though, like, what happens if you have a boss that just doesn't have the empathy thing? Like, just doesn't, it's not necessarily their fault. They're just not good at it. They don't know how to do it, etc. When you're dealing with these kind of situations, and Jim, maybe I'll start with you because you also deal with, as a consultant with different companies too, is there accountability that needs to happen? Like, do this empathy or else? Like, does that work?
Well, it's a great point, actually. And as you know, many things actually start with leadership, role modeling behaviors. And so one of the things that we talk about is while COVID-19 has been a massive disruption, the world for many years has been disrupted. And we talk about we're in an era of constant change or always on transformation. And so in this environment, you think about it, people are constantly being asked to step up, reach further, run faster, learn to work with new tools, some of which actually might even replace them in the workplace. And so we've been in, let's just call it, a fairly high change environment for quite some time. And so one of the things that we talk about with our clients is in that environment, yes, you need to lead with your heads. You need to provide clear direction for your teams. You need to also lead with your hands. You need to mobilize resources and deliver success. But there's this very important dimension, which is the heart. You need to also lead with your heart. And our data, and we've done research into this, suggests that most leaders naturally tend towards leading with their heads and their hands, but they actually don't lead enough with their hearts. And so one of the things that we do with our clients is say, hey, this is a now not just a nice to have, this is an absolute requirement. Leaders need to lead with head, heart, and hands. And part of heart, what do we mean by heart? Well, heart is about giving people a sense of purpose and meaning. And why are we showing up for work? It's also creating a culture that gives people an environment in which they can actually work productively, some of the things we've been talking about. But one of the very important dimensions, it's also empathy. It's caring for people whose lives are being disrupted. And so, part of it is, yes, you do have to say the world requires something very different of a leader now, which is you have to lead with your heart.
I'd like to add to that a little bit. Yeah. So I want to push back, Alix, on your comment of like, well, let's say they're just not empathetic. But when I look at empathy, I think it's
I swear it happens.
Oh, no, it totally happens. I'm not saying it doesn't happen. But the fact that people can't be empathetic, that can't be something that is a learned trait, is where I think I would push back. And not that you're saying that specifically, but when I look at empathy, it's, in my mind, it's the ability to understand, to relate to, and respect people who maybe are coming at things from a different perspective, a different background, a different X, whatever it happens to be. And so if we look at those three things, respect, that's something that we hire for. It's embedded in our values. And so I'll leave that to the side and hope that we have a respect, and I have experienced that at Atlassian. Relate to, I think we are at no better time to relate to each other and all the craziness that is happening in everyone's world. And so then it boils down to that understand piece. And when we look at it, there is a whole lot to happen there. But I think the first step is awareness. And I mentioned that earlier, was sort of the awareness of the complexity of the roles and that people are playing, whether it's in their house, in their day-to-day job, their network, how do they connect with people, things like that. But once we start to build that awareness, then I think there's a number of tools that we can give the willing manager. And I think that's the trick there, is the willing manager. And for those that are very numbers driven, all the research points to higher productivity when people are motivated. There's tons of research about that. So if you want to take that, or if you take it sort of, I want to retain these people. If people are less motivated, feeling disconnected, they will leave. So I think there's a lot of data that would drive someone who otherwise wouldn't to start to do that. So there's lots of tools that we can give people. And one of the ones that I have borrowed from Positive Coaching Alliance is the filling of emotional tanks. And that's something that we all have. We all have an emotional tank. I can fill it or I can drain it with every interaction that I have. And if we can get to a higher positive than negative, then people are in a place that they are feeling motivated, they are feeling understood, they are feeling heard. And to Joy's point, then we can start to move on to, the next levels of those things. So while empathy in and of itself, maybe we can't train that, I think there's lots of steps that we can take to get people closer to empathizing with their employees.
Well, to jump on that, Joy, I mean, Eli Lilly is huge. So is there accountability though? Like if you take surveys and a group is unhappy, is there accountability to that manager? Like how does that, it sounds good, so how do you make sure it happens?
Well, I think accountability has to be embedded in everything that we do. And we have to be very clear of what our expectations are of leaders. I remember not long after the pandemic hit, and we began to get input from our employee resource groups just on asking, what are your needs? What are you struggling with? One of them was around making sure that they had more connection time with their leaders. So we created a tool called Leading During a Time of Crisis. And we're very specific on our core expectations of our leaders. Our CEO and the head of our human resources practice sent emails out and were very clear on behaviors that they were going to model, but also the expectations they had of their organizations. And I think accountability in its most natural state outside of a process is about asking questions. When you're having one-to-ones with your other leaders, simply saying, how often are you checking on your team? What's the pulse of your organization? How have you created new norms? And what are you doing to ensure flexibility, given this new dynamic in workplace that we're all trying to figure out? When leaders began to ask those questions, but also model those behaviors, people learn very quickly, and it's a clear signal, is that around this is what we're going to be holding you accountable for, and that this will be part of how we assess your performance.
Such a good point. Hey, Jim, we have a question from someone from the audience, which I think that you might be able to speak to pretty well, considering the consultancy aspect. Many companies having to restructure, downsize because of the pandemic. There were a lot of layoffs that were kind of tabled that are now kind of coming back. How do leaders engage with employees when now you got people who have to do double the work, less time to connect, and go through layoffs or salary reductions? That's a really tough environment.
Yeah, that is a tough environment, and unfortunately, the reality is that is true for many companies now, and it's hit different industries obviously very differently. I would say a couple of things. First of all, what we really encourage companies to do is as you're downsizing, don't just downsize, the number of people, but actually fundamentally rethink the way work is being done. So that, that everyone talks about that we need to actually change the processes and the tools that we give people so that the people that are left behind can actually be more productive and to be able to rise to the challenge that's required. But another thing that's very important, and we've seen great success with different clients, and I'll use the term bridge. Think about it as a bridge that you need to build, both for the employees that are staying, helping them to bridge to their new roles, their new responsibilities, but also for the people that are leaving. Many organizations used to essentially just walk someone to the door and say goodbye and think that they had done the responsibility, maybe if they gave them severance. Now we're seeing companies take a much more expansive view to what does it mean to build a bridge to what comes next for you, and to feel ownership for that. That until that person has gone through career counseling, has met with someone who can help them find an next position, that you've leveraged your network in the company and your set of partners to help them find their next opportunity. So really thinking about your responsibility goes much further than just handing them severance. So I would say those are a couple of things, help people that are left behind to be able to rise to the challenge by being more productive, but very importantly, help the people that are leaving.
So on that point, like that feels more concrete, right? Like you go through building the bridge, career restructuring, et cetera. How do you know if what you're doing is working? Like, what are the metrics that you have to look at? You're all kind of laughing / smiling at me now. So, Molly, do you have thoughts on that?
Yes, we do. I mean, to this point, we actually do a lot of check-ins that are the sort of the one-on-one piece of it. But we also do twice yearly a vital signs approach, where every manager with more than 3 people is assessed 360 And that manager gets those results. Actually, just came out today. And then the expectation is that the manager digests those and then shares them with their directs and shares them broadly. We have a very transparent culture. So we use a Confluence page, which is an internal wiki, and people can see what's happening and hold each other accountable. So I think that those metrics around like not only how are we performing, how are we meeting our OKRs, KPIs, things like that, but also how are our employees feeling? We are assessed on, are we living the values? Our values are very strong. It's not just some posters on the wall at Atlassian. They determine how we make decisions and how we lead our day-to-day life. So are people living those values? Is that being seen? And then turning that into action. And I think that's the biggest thing is there action at the end of the day? Because it's all nice to hold someone accountable, to say, yep, here's the result, and I acknowledge it. But then to actually do something on the back end is really important. And we are fortunate at Atlassian that our culture is such that everyone will hold each other accountable, and you will hear very quickly if something is not happening, if some promise was made and it was not done, not in a mean way, but just sort of how can we make this company better, and how can we make each other better.
We have about 4 minutes left, and we did get a question from the audience that is another good point. Amazingly, people have been actually hired in the middle of the pandemic, but then have like never been in the office and never met their coworkers. So what do you do with that? Particularly if if they're junior, sure, but even if they're senior, that's extraordinarily difficult. Joy, can you give me some insight into what you think about that?
Yes, I think it's very important that teams establish new norms and conditions around the way in which they want to work. I can speak for a number of teams at Lilly. We've developed things like after-hour events, on where we meet and we don't talk about work at all. As it relates to onboarding new employees, ensuring that they have a mentor within their team, but also someone outside of their team. And we're working with our employee resource groups to connect with them, even just on the social aspects. I think it's very important that we check in more often than we ever have, and meet with those new individuals, because it could be very easy in a relationship-driven organization, being new, to feel alone and isolated. If we don't plant some of those organic kind of drive-bys that you normally would have inside a work environment. And personally, one of the things that I do every day, I pick up my cell phone and call one of my team members, just as I would if I was walking through the building. Off the script, not on the schedule, just to see how they're doing and let them know that I'm thinking about them and be responsive to any questions or needs they may have. So I think those are just some easy tips that leaders can take.
That's awesome. Hey, Jim, what do you think?
Yeah, one of the things that's fortunate for us is that we typically onboard people directly into teams. And so they're able to feel that they're part of a small group, a pod, if you will, where there's naturally a little bit more of an intimate connection. But I think, in client organizations also, you can think, about how do you create those small team units where people don't feel they're just being onboarded into a huge organization, but into an intimate group that actually cares for them. And then some of the things that we've all been talking about, which is regular pulse checks, and in our case, this PTO facilitator that checks in with the teams. But also one of the most important things that we've alluded to is time with senior people. And so, things like when a senior partner would be at a client and part of the case team and with the client, and then after a meeting, you'd walk back. We're trying to recreate what were some of the things that happened in the real world that we can now replicate in a virtual world to make it feel as though it's less of a two-dimensional interaction, but it's a three-dimensional interaction, if you will. How do we create that third dimension, even though physically we're forced to deal with a two-dimensional world?
Molly, how about you? Final thoughts on that?
Yeah, we have actually onboarded 25% of our population since COVID started. And so it's over 1,000 people. And so we've spent a lot of time. We were able to shift that in about 3 weeks. And the three pieces that we really focused on were, what are the role-specific things that they need to know? What are the cultural components that they need to know? And what's the tribal knowledge that they need to get? And then we found a lot of different mechanisms, similar to what you all had, but also just sort of, again, I keep saying it, but it's really important. Those micro interactions seem to have the most value in all three of those categories. So I'll pause with that. I know we're running short.